Hello and welcome to this first edition of Beyond the Royal Headlines, a new monthly Zoom event. I'm Graham Smith, and this is very new and very live, so apologies if there are any glitches along the way. Now, I'm going to be talking to you about the Duchies and dispatches. What I found out when I visited the Scilly Isles a few years back, and why the Duchy of Cornwall and Duchy of Lancaster are not the private property of the royals. Beyond the Royal Headlines will be 7 p.m. on the first Tuesday of every month. In January, I'm going to be taking a closer look at the UK's rotten constitution, why it leaves us dangerously exposed in an age of populism and extremism, and why monarchs have been a disaster in defending democracy. That's Beyond the Royal Headlines, The King and the Constitution, 7 p.m. on Tuesday, January 7th. And don't forget to use the Q&A function, which you can find in your Zoom controls. Keep questions coming in over the next half hour or so, and then we'll go through a bit of a Q&A in the second part of this event. Now, these new shows are, of course, brought to you by Republic, which campaigns for the abolition of the monarchy and a democratic alternative. Republic has been growing enormously over the last 2 years, while support for abolition of the monarchy has also been growing in the polls. Now, Republicans have a ton of work to do to win, but we will win with your help. So check out the website at republic.org.uk. And if you haven't already, make sure to join, donate, get your merchandise, and of course, get involved. Now, last month, Channel 4's dispatches, working with the Sunday Times, revealed the thousands of properties owned and run by the Duchies of Cornwall and Lancaster. Now, they showed how the duchies were making their millions by charging private rents, land rents for leaseholds, and through commercial development of property. Now, they were making money from schools, hospitals, the military, and charities, including charities such as Macmillan and RNLI, and they are not being properly taxed. Now, the documentary caused real anger and widespread concern across the media, although not a single royal correspondent commented on it. But it is interesting that the Sunday Times and Dispatches did this at all. There have been documentaries and exposés before, but this is the first big exposé about the reigning monarch, and there was no real sense of holding back criticism of Charles or William. Now, for Republic, not all of this was new. We've looked at this issue in the past. We've included the duchies in the cost of the monarchy in our new report, which I'll come back to shortly. Now, in 2020, we also launched our own documentary, The Man Who Shouldn't Be King, which, among other things, looked at the Duchy of Cornwall. Now, I'll come back to what we heard when we visited the Scilly Isles a bit later on. Dispatches, of course, was able to do much more detailed investigation into these two property empires. Now, if you didn't see the documentary or the Sunday Times report, it's worth a quick run through some of the quite remarkable revelations and details of the scam that they call duchies. Now, before we do that, let's remind ourselves that the duchies are what the duchies are. Now, I called them property empires, and the label fits. In the word of the Sunday Times, they make money on commercial rents and feudal levies on lands largely seized by medieval monarchs. Between them, the duchies own as much as 180,000 acres of land across England and Wales. Now, they've both been crown land for centuries, held by the state to provide an income to the king and his heir, an income also used in large part to fund the state. Now, when most of that crown land was surrendered to Parliament, MPs agreed that the royals could hold on to the two duchies as a source of independent income. Back in the 18th and 19th centuries, the duchies weren't worth so much, and the income was a fraction of what it is today. Now, Parliament gifted them the income from the duchies and control over them, but they didn't gift the duchies themselves. But the royals went on to exploit the arrangement to generate huge personal and largely untaxed incomes. Now, last year, the Duchy of Lancaster paid a personal income to Charles of £27 million, and Cornwall paid William £23 million. Corporation tax isn't paid, income tax is voluntary, and they won't say what they do pay. Now, that's money that could and should be spent on public services, but instead it's public services that are giving money to the duchies. Now, I'll come back to how we know the duchies aren't private property a little later. But the big uproar following dispatches was particularly acute because of the revelation that schools, hospitals, the army, and charities were paying huge sums to Charles and William. Commercial developments, private rentals, and leasehold ground rents were all in the spotlight. Now, leasehold is one of the big scandals waiting to blow up in the UK. It's already being picked up by a lively campaign, and there's a lot of pressure to get rid of it. But it's a feudal concept that the landowner can retain ownership of the land, the freehold, and just sell you the right to own the property on that land. And the freeholder will then charge a ground rent, even though you own the house you live in or the office building you work in. And this is different to private rental, which is a normal commercial arrangement. This is rent for nothing. Now, you can buy your house, extend it, and renovate it, have a mortgage and wish to leave it to your children. But if someone else owns the freehold, the land your house stands on, then they can and will charge you rent for it without any obligation to do anything in return. Now, it is these kinds of leasehold rents that mean the duchies are charging local schools, hospitals, fire brigades, and the military for use of land which state-owned buildings sit on. Now, the Duchy of Cornwall claims to own Dartmoor, so it charges the army to conduct its exercises there. For decades, the Duchy has also been charging the government for Dartmoor Prison. Now, even today, after the prison has closed, the Duchy charges the government £1.5 million a year for the land that the prison stands on. The Sunday Times reported the rent would add up to £37.5 million over the 25-year life of the lease, and that the land rent has more than doubled since the 1980s, even after taking into account inflation. And to add insult to injury, the Ministry of Justice is required to spend £68 million over the next decade updating the prison buildings as stipulated in the leasehold agreement. The prison is closed. No one is there. But Charles and now William continue to demand money from the government for a building they don't own, knowing that when the leasehold comes back, they can take possession of the buildings which have been maintained in good working order for their future redevelopment. Last year, the Duchy of Lancaster very proudly announced that it was delighted to be able to help and support the St. Thomas's NHS Trust by granting a red brick warehouse for storing a new fleet of electric vehicles. Such generosity, of course, except it was nothing of the sort. The NHS were being charged rent of £829,000 a year by Charles. That's over £11 million over 15 years. And that's a 67% increase on what the Met Police were being charged when they were using the same building just a year earlier. Shameless profiteering by Charles at the expense of the NHS. Now, the Navy has a base in Devonport, 30 miles down the coast from Plymouth. The Navy owns the base. The Duchy of Cornwall owns the shoreline, so the Duchy decided to charge the Navy £10,000 a year simply to cross the shoreline to access their own base. Then they charged £3,250 a year for the Navy to have a jetty out over the shoreline, and they stipulated that the MOD must spend at least £90,000 on construction of the jetty. Now, even when the Navy wanted to deploy navigation beacons in the sea, the Duchy insisted on a £100 fee, as if they cannot help themselves but demand more money left, right, and centre. Now, the madness of all this is that the duchies are state assets, not private estates. Parliament has granted Charles and William the right to treat them as a private estate and to keep the profits, yet the estates belong to the state, to the Crown. So with all these and many more examples of public services and the military paying the duchies, we are essentially allowing the royals to charge us for using or crossing over our own land. There is also a question mark as to why the government chose to procure these buildings and build on this land. Why not build on land they already own outright, where there is no leasehold arrangement or where there are better commercial terms? Now, we can assume there is a lot of lobbying going on and a lot of questionable decisions being made in Whitehall as a result of that lobbying from senior royals. Now, in just a moment, I'll be telling you about my own visit to the Scilly Isles. Just a quick reminder, however, to check out Republic's website at republic.org.uk. We do have a lot of great merchandise and books on sale, and you can join Republic for as little as £3 a month if you haven't already. I also want to tell you about two big dates that we've got for your diary. Republic Day on May 10th and Trooping in the Colour protest on June 14th. 2 dates for your diary, opportunities to celebrate the cause, to champion democracy, enjoy a great day out, and on June 14th to protest directly outside Buckingham Palace when the royals come out on the balcony. Now, these protests are an important part of Republic's strategy, and they're also a great way to respond to the sorts of issues you're going to hear about tonight and at future programs such as this. Now, this strategy is about disrupting the image of a nation of royalists, and I'll be talking more about the campaign and the progress Republic is making in emails and videos coming out soon. So make sure you're signed up for all our email updates and subscribed to Republic's YouTube channel. Links on the website. Now, in 2016, while making Republic's documentary, I ventured down to the Scilly Isles. We were there to do some filming and interview some locals. Now, you can find The Man Who Shouldn't Be King on Republic's YouTube channel. There's a whole load of other videos there as well. You have to scroll down to the end to find this documentary, which we launched in 2020. Now, what we found when we visited Scilly Isles was pretty shocking. One local, Alan Davis, was more than happy to be interviewed. He'd been battling the duchy for years, trying to win the right to buy the freehold for his home. He owned his house, but he didn't own the land it stood on. He was a leaseholder. Now, in most of the UK, if you are a leaseholder, in most circumstances, you have the legal right to buy the freehold. So you own the land and the building. Not here, not on Scilly Isles. The duchy had been given an exemption from leasehold reform laws over the decades, and Alan had no such right as is enjoyed elsewhere in the country. He could ask, he could demand, but the duchy could simply say no. Now, this can cause real financial problems for leaseholders and gives the freeholders significant leverage. Now, we tried speaking to other locals, and many were happy to chat, but not on camera. They were scared of reprisals from the duchy. They told stories of leasehold ground rent suddenly going up by thousands of pounds a year, of a farmer facing uncertainty because of the short lease on the land his farm was built on. And I've heard similar stories of scared tenants and scared leaseholders from journalists who have tried looking at this issue as well. Now, we were shown roads that were falling apart because they were on duchy land, while council-owned roads were well maintained. There were just a few of them on the island. The duchy, we were told, only took money off the islands. It never invested anything back. They charge for every boat that moors, every flight that lands. Now, the duchy, in the words of Alan Davis, was Charles's own personal fiefdom. It was feudal. And you can check out the full documentary on Republic's YouTube channel, as I said before. Now, private tenants, too, are suffering due to mismanagement by the duchy. Dispatches showed numerous privately rented homes suffering from damp and poor insulation, tenants living in fuel poverty while handing rents to a prince who claims to care about homelessness. Now, William and Charles like to lecture us about the environment too, yet use these duchies to invest in damaging, high-carbon polluting mining projects across the UK, including in beautiful places such as Cornwall and Yorkshire moors. So it's no wonder that they make more than 50 million profit between them every year from these two duchies. Now, as far as we know, it's all largely tax-free. Neither duchy pays corporation tax, despite both operating like commercial businesses. The Sunday Times quoted Andrew Sanford, a tax advisor, saying the duchy's tax exemption gives them an unfair competitive advantage because it allows them to keep more of the money they make, as compared to other businesses, of course. Last year's increase, he said, in corporation tax from 19 to 25% exacerbated this advantage. Indeed. Now, this is a huge, unique commercial advantage for William and Charles for no reason other than accident of birth. Now, in 2014, the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee, chaired by Margaret Hodge, decided to investigate tax avoidance by big companies like Amazon, Starbucks, and Google. Now, the public raised the issue of the Duchy of Cornwall not paying corporation tax, and our campaign was reported in The Guardian, and we asked our members to write to their MPs to get them to lobby Hodge to include the duchy in their investigation, which she then did. And the duchy came up with all sorts of excuses for not paying corporation tax and wouldn't even come clean on what property they own. The Republic gave evidence too, dismantling the duchy's reasons for avoiding the tax. Now, in the Dispatches documentary, Hodge said, "I was able to calculate more readily what Google, Amazon, and Starbucks should have paid us in taxes than I was the duchies." Now, why do we put up with this? Now, the duchies are not their private property. We do not owe the royals a living. It's time we took these duchies off their hands, rolled them into the Crown estates, and insisted the royals pay tax. Now, royalists will jump up and down at my insistence that the duchies aren't the private property of the royals, but unfortunately for them, the case is actually pretty clear. Now, they say the same about the Crown estate too, that it's the private property of the royals, that if we abolish the monarchy, we have to hand the Crown estate over to the Windsor Mountbatten family. And it is simply not true. This is nonsense. And here's someone else who agrees with me. This is not a radical. He's not a campaigner. He's not a revolutionary. This was Spencer Walpole. He lived from 1839 to 1907, the grandson of 2 prime ministers and the son of a home secretary. Every bit the establishment man. Now, he is just one of a litany of public and parliamentary figures who have made it clear over the last 250 years that Crown lands are state property, not the personal possession of the monarch. On the so-called surrender of these lands, he said, and I quote, "A surrender of this kind once made was virtually irrevocable. It would have been impossible for any future sovereign to have resumed a revenue for which his predecessors had surrendered, as it would have been impracticable for him to have restored the Star Chamber or to have made the appointment of judges dependent on his pleasure." In other words, the surrender was theatre, a fiction, and a rearranging of state finances by Parliament. The king had no real choice in the matter then and has absolutely no choice in the matter now. Now, it is a persistent misunderstanding of royal funding that the royals own the Crown estate and the 2 duchies, as we see in many reports throughout the press. Now, this misunderstanding appears to be deliberately encouraged by the palace, who routinely claim the duchies are private and make statements that can easily mislead the public to believe the Crown estate somehow contributes to the funding of the monarchy. It doesn't. And this includes Charles suggesting that he was personally suggesting that he wanted Crown estate money to go into public services. It was a deeply dishonest statement. Now, in no meaningful sense is the funding the monarchy received in 2024 in exchange for funds the government received from the Crown estate. Regardless of royal funding arrangements agreed by Parliament, Crown estate revenue will always go to the Treasury, no matter what the monarch may wish to happen. Now, Lord Turnbull, Cabinet Secretary under Blair, made the point when he said the link between the sovereign grant and the Crown estate was pretty artificial, and that there was no relationship between the net income of the Crown estate and the funding of the monarchy, and there has not been since 1760. Now, the Crown estate is an organisation that dates back only as far as 1961, and its purpose is to manage revenue-generating land on behalf of the Treasury. Charles has no say in the management and the Crown estates or its revenue. Now, the Crown estate reports directly to the Treasury, and the government determines who sits on the Crown estate's board. Now, this distinction between ownership by the Crown and private ownership by the monarch has existed since well before any surrender of revenues or the creation of the civil list. Now, until Parliament passed the Crown Private Estate Act in 1880, the king was not permitted to privately own land at all. So he simply wasn't allowed to be in possession of private property. Now, the Crown owned the land separate from the person on the throne for a very simple, pragmatic reason: to ensure that a change of monarch wouldn't lead to the loss of state lands, as those lands were the primary source of income for the state. So when kings were defeated in battle or revolution, the property remained with the Crown as the Crown was passed up to a different monarch. And there's more on this in Republic's recent £500 million Royals report, which you can also find on Republic's website. So let's get back to the duchies of Cornwall and Lancaster. Now, these two duchies, they both belong to the Crown, a state institution. Now, as explained before, the king was not allowed to own private property until 1800, hundreds of years after the duchies were formed. The 1337 charter, which established the Duchy of Cornwall, was clear from the outset that it was only for the use of the heir who is also the eldest son of the monarch. It wasn't the personal property of the monarch's son, but held by the crown for heirs of the future. It was indivisible from the crown, not from the man on the throne or the duke. Now, there are many ways that you can illustrate this point. As I'm sure you're aware, our constitution is pretty weird, and it says that the king must be a Protestant. So, for instance, were William to convert to Catholicism, he would lose his position as heir and therefore lose the duchy. Now, were that to happen, George would become heir. But as he is not the eldest son of the monarch, he would not be Duke of Cornwall. Instead, the revenue would revert to the crown and paid to the monarch. The sovereign grant would be reduced by an equal amount, which means the duchy's revenue would be used by the government to offset official costs of the monarchy. Likewise, when Edward VIII was forced to abdicate, in large part due to his sympathies with the Nazis, he did not retain personal ownership of the Duchy of Lancaster. He was still alive, nothing was inherited, the revenue was simply paid instead to his brother, the new king, while the Duchy of Cornwall reverted to the crown, as the new king had no sons, just two daughters. Now, in typical dishonest fashion, the Duchy of Lancaster website explains that in 1399, this guy, the new king, Henry IV, passed a law which set out the conditions in which the Lancaster inheritance should be held, specifying that it should be held separately from all other crown possessions and should be descend through the monarchy as a private estate. Sounds interesting, but what they neglect to mention was that when this guy, Edward IV, became king 40 years later, a new law was passed in which the duchy was declared forfeited by the House of Lancaster and annexed to the crown, becoming vested in Edward IV in his, quote, body politic, which means official capacity. Now it's now owned by the crown, not personally by the king. And we know this because the title of this law that was passed is an act for incorporating and also for the confiscating of Duchy of Lancaster to the Crown of England forever. Subsequent legislation confirms the point. Now, both estates must report to Parliament, and the abolition of both estates with their assets rolled into the Crown lands has been debated more than once in Parliament. These estates are state property. Parliament chooses to allow their profits to be paid to the monarch and heir as a private income. Parliament could and should decide to end that arrangement. Now, Labour leader Clem Attlee, some years before becoming Prime Minister, argued in Parliament that the duchies, and I quote, cannot be considered in any way to be private estates. Whatever may have happened in the past, they had now descended with the crown and have in fact become attached to the positions of King and Prince of Wales. Therefore, we think they should be assimilated to the position of the other crown lands. Quite very smart man. Now, the only reasonable interpretation of the current arrangements is that the state pays Charles and William a personal income of more than £23 million each, £27 million for Charles last year. Now compare that to the Prime Minister's salary of £166,000 and the recent furore over the salaries of political advisors. And we must ask why. Why do we pay the head of state and his eldest son annual salaries of more than £23 million each? Why do we pay the son anything at all? Now, the Public Accounts Committee had pointed out that the current arrangements stem from the 14th century and the resulting income is to that extent an accident of history. So surely it is time to reassess that arrangement, scrap the duchies and abandon any pretense of a link between crown land, revenue and the funding of the monarchy. Now, Dispatches and the Sunday Times have done us all a huge favour. The Republic will continue to campaign on this issue as a way to drive home the point that the monarchy is a corrupt and secretive institution pursuing its own interests at the expense of the country. And don't believe for a second when a royalist says this is all done by others, that Charles and William aren't hands-on with this. Their staff have repeatedly made it clear they are hands-on. So they are responsible for the reprehensible arrangements we have with these two property empires. This is on them, and they need to be called out for it. Now, we've been getting a ton of questions come through. Thank you very much. And I'm really pleased that we're getting so many people on here. So I'm just going to grab a few and start answering them. Please do still keep asking those questions. And if you want to put where you are from as well, that's always interesting to see where people are joining us from, but you don't have to at all. Raj asked if this is happening in other places or two other places in the UK and abroad. I mean, this is something which is particular to England and Wales, where the two duchies are. So there is the Crown Estate affects the whole of the UK to some extent, but the Crown Estate is already parliamentary property, if you like, state property. So that is less of an issue because all that revenue is coming in to the Treasury. Although it is an issue in Wales, where there are people campaigning that the Crown Estate revenue should go to the Welsh government, not to Westminster, because in Scotland it does go to the Scottish government. So there seems to be an imbalance. I'm not aware that anything like this happens elsewhere, certainly in connection with the British Crown. Now, someone's asking about the numbers being available. Now, a lot of what I've mentioned is definitely look up the Times report, although it is behind a firewall, paywall, I should say. But the documentary is still online on YouTube and on the Channel 4 website. Our report on the cost of the monarchy is on the website, on Republic's website as well. So there's a lot of information in there that you can get into. And it's been asked when, why aren't people debating this in Parliament? This is an issue. And in fact, if you look back at parliamentary records from the 1950s or the 1930s, MPs were more willing then than they are now to speak up on this. And I think there's it's a bit of an indictment on the state of our politics, really, and our party, and the extent to which leaderships control and whip backbenchers. But we are working on that. We've had thousands of emails go to MPs over the last few months about a number of different issues. And what I would say is whoever your MP is, definitely email them whenever these things come up. Demand answers, get them to write to government ministers, get them to write to committee chairs and so on. And we will do everything we can to provide you the relevant information. But there is, if you go to republic.org.uk/mymp, you can find some forms there to write to your MP about a number of different issues, including the duchies. I think that there is, however, a general acquiescence or a general reluctance on politicians at the moment to speak up. I think they just don't want to rock the boat. They want a quiet life on this. They've got other issues, and it is very much down to us to push them. John's asked about railways crossing the duchies and who pays. I don't actually know. That's an interesting point. There are bridges and ferries, jetties, as I mentioned before, going over water over shoreline. I don't actually know whether the owners of, I guess it's all Network Rail these days, whether they have to pay land rent. I assume they must do, but that's an interesting point that's definitely worth digging into. And there's an interesting point here about from Mike, the fact that there's so many websites, news websites, obviously the royal website, do say that these things are owned by the monarch and Prince of Wales. Now, I have got into the habit of emailing anybody that says this, journalists, and saying that's not correct. I think we're going to do a big issue, a big sort of push on this in the new year about not just about the getting rid of the duchies, but really hammering home the point that we own them. The royals do not own them. I think we want to make that point itself quite a big headline. And I think we're going to be maybe trying to pull some of this together in a new report, press releasing it, maybe doing some new protests around the duchy and so on. So yeah, so Suzanne was asking about what happened to the Duchy of Cornwall income when George VI was king. There was no Prince of Wales, and this is the point. It basically went back to the Treasury, as I understand it. It was much less. It was much smaller amount of income as well, and it's really been during the late Queen's reign and Charles's period as Duke of Cornwall that they have really ramped up the amount of um, uh, income. They've turned it into this really hard-headed business that is massively expanded. So yeah, I mean the precise details. I mean it's a little bit confused because they've changed the rules slightly. I think where the if you don't have a duke now, it goes to the king, but then they deduct the amount from what they give to the king from the government. So it's still the same amounts to the same thing. So exactly which way around they did that back in the 1940s. I don't have the answer to that, but it would have essentially amounted to the same thing that the state gets the money. Um, David asked about the alternative option to replace the monarchy as head of state. Now, I won't go into a lot of detail. The next episode of Beyond the Royal Headlines, which is on January 7th, the King and the Constitution, I will definitely get into that in a lot more detail because we'll be looking at the failure of the monarchy as a constitutional institution. And we will be getting into some of the detail about what the alternative is. But in short, it is a parliamentary system where you have a written constitution with two houses of parliament, and an elected head of state who is not running the country, but who is holding certain reserve powers, which can be really useful. Yeah, and Ken they're saying about the his MP saying they've got bigger fish to fry. The thing is with MPs again, the more people that write to them, the more likely they're going to engage with this. I think actually these things are this is big fish to fry. I think this is important, but there's just a lot of lack of awareness, and I think that we can probably, if we keep on hammering away at this, we can probably get some action on the duchy. As well as other key issues like the secrecy and their exemptions from a whole load of different laws. So I'm just scrolling down some of these questions. There's loads of great questions, and there are lots of them, so apologies if I don't get around to all of them. But there is plenty of time. So yeah, I mean, Lorna's asking about the oaths that the monarchs take, and yes, I appreciate that there are. There was this Union of Crowns, and yes, he hasn't taken the Scottish oath. I mean, I'm aware of these things. If I was Scottish, if I'm living in Scotland, I'd be more concerned that there was a monarch at all. I wouldn't necessarily want him swearing an oath to Scotland. I think that the oaths that really aggrieve, which I think are really egregious, are the ones that ordinary people have to swear to him. I think that's something which definitely has to be ditched, but maybe it's something which has to wait until we get rid of the monarchy. But I think we will definitely be looking at that again. And my hat off to Clive Lewis, MP, who made a big fuss about the oaths back at the time, just after the election, when they had to take them for this parliament. There's someone asking about why the press support the royals so much and don't educate the public. Now, I do think that there's an interesting point here. I mean, as of course, Sunday Times is a relatively conservative newspaper, but it has been part of this big investigation. The press have got a curious relationship with the royals, and we can do a whole thing on the press and the media and the royals in the future, I think. They're quite happy to have a go at the royals, but they have one eye on their belief, and probably accurate belief, that most of their readers, if not everybody in the country, are reasonably pro monarchy. So they will often criticize and attack the royals, but then say, look, it can all be fixed, we can reform it, etc. And aren't they lovely? Their calculation is that royal stories sell papers, which there is truth to that, but also negative royal stories do as well. So it very much varies. I mean, a newspaper like the Telegraph, it'll be an editorial position, but I think the Times, which is owned by Murdoch, will take a more pragmatic view. And again, it comes with us showing people that, or showing the press that there is a growing groundswell of support. And then they might start to move in our direction. Yeah, and there's a question from an A phoner about how dispatches got permitted or permission to air the program. I mean, you know, broadcasters can air these things. It's not the first time dispatches has done something like this. The BBC tends to be really reluctant to it, but Channel 4 has not been too bad. But there was a lot of delay. It was commented that it came out just before the US election, so the big story around this got slightly swamped by that. But the reason why it came out late, or came out that weekend, was because it was supposed to be out, I think 2 or 3 weeks earlier, and there were clearly a lot of lawyers arguing about some of the details. So to what extent it got edited or changed or whatever, I don't know, but it was certainly it certainly met with some resistance. And yeah, Ian, referring the Crown Estate to the national estate, I mean, I think this is actually something which we proposed should be done in law quite some time ago. And I think it's a very simple, easy change. And I think that it should go hand in hand with scrapping the sovereign grant, which is an appalling arrangement. And there is this idea that the Crown Estate belongs to the royals and also funds the royals through the sovereign grant. And it gives the impression that they are self-funding. And I sort of mentioned in passing this thing that where Charles sort of said, oh, you know, I want the money to be spent on public services. And this was, I think, was at the beginning of last year or this year, where they put out a statement saying, look, you know, Charles is aware that the profits of the Crown Estate are going up. And so he's asked the government to reduce the percentage that he gets so that more of this money is spent on the public good. Now, this is so dishonest for 2 reasons. Firstly, Charles had absolutely no say in the matter whatsoever. It wasn't his decision. It doesn't belong to him. He doesn't control the Crown Estates. And secondly, because even though they reduced the percentage from 25 down to 12, the actual cash value of the grant is going to go up by almost 50%, by £45 million. And yet they said it's going to be a reduction. I mean, it was blatant dishonesty on the part of Charles and his press team. And I think that is just another reason why, and of course, the Crown Estate does not fund the monarchy. The only relationship there is between calculations to increase the sovereign grant. If the profits go up of the Crown Estate, the grant goes up, regardless of any need, regardless of whether they need an extra £45 million, it just goes up. If it goes down, if the Crown Estate profits go down, then the sovereign grant stays unchanged. So it's a beautiful arrangement for them. It really is, and it just keeps on ratcheting up the size of the grant, and it can't go down. Even if they set next year's percentage at 0 of the Crown Estate, the actual sovereign grant won't go down because it can't go down. They'd actually have to change the arrangement for it to go back down again. Jen was asking about current or past MPs who are on board with this issue. Yes, I mean there are. I mean it's a relatively new parliament. There's been quite a lot of change over the last few years of MPs, and obviously a big changeover this year. We have people like Clive Lewis. Unfortunately, lost Tommy Shepherd, who was very supportive. Certainly lost him from Parliament, I should say. He's still very, very keen. But we are working on developing new contacts there, and we're getting a lot of positive MP responses to emails being sent by our members and supporters who are writing to their own MP. So we are still working on that. Yeah, Margaret's asking about George Osborne's role in this. Now, that's an interesting point because George Osborne was the Chancellor when the sovereign grant was introduced. And it's been said many times over the years that Charles was lobbying for this kind of arrangement that they got in 2011, was lobbying for years, and was certainly lobbying under Blair and Brown. And Blair and Brown said, no, don't be ridiculous. I mean, this is clearly not something which is going to work. And when the Tories came in 2010, they pretty much rolled over straight away and said, yeah, that sounds great, let's do that. And part of the reason, and I think George Osborne actually admitted this, part of the reason of this, for this arrangement for them, was that it essentially removed this question of royal funding from politics. You know, it used to be that the civil list had to come back to Parliament every now and again, every 10 years, I think it was, and be reintroduced as, for Parliament to agree, and it gave opportunities for people to criticise and to raise questions. The new arrangement doesn't do that. It just goes up and goes up and goes up, and the only people that get to really have a say is this small commission made up of one of the monarch's senior advisors, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. So Parliament gets very little look at. Now, they did say that the increased scrutiny by laying the full accounts in front of Parliament and introducing the involvement of the National Audit Office. Since 2011, when the sovereign grant came in, the Public Accounts Committee has looked at it once, about 10 years ago, and the National Audit Office has looked at it once, again, I think about 10 years ago. That's it. So, you know, and this is absolutely George Osborne's creation, but as a result of lobbying from the royals. Yeah, so Sasha is asking about how to bring this issue up with people. And I guess some people are reticent to get into it. I find that, I mean, I've been doing this a long time, and I find that people are a lot less reticent to get into it. Obviously, it very much depends on your circumstances, your community, the people that you know, and so on. I think that part of it is maybe coming at it through issues like the Dispatches documentary, because a lot of monarchists are also upset by these things. I won't say who it was, but I had a reasonably high profile very conservative journalist on the phone last week saying, look, you know, he wants to write something about this because he supports the monarchy, but he's pretty upset that the way that they behave. There was A.N. Wilson, the very monarchist journalist and historian, writing in the Mail a couple of weeks ago, basically saying that the monarchy is in serious trouble, and saying that the Republicans' arguments are starting to cut through. And the reason why, in his view, is the greed of the royals. He's saying this is appalling, all this stuff that came out in Dispatches. So that sort of thing. And also things like, you know, you can drop into conversations, things like the protests and so on, and just say, well, you know, it's free speech. Because you'll find when we had people arrested, we had a lot of people who were monarchists saying, look, I don't agree with you, but this is outrageous. You should be allowed to protest. So there's a lot of common ground there that I think people will want to get on board with. The £500 million figure, Michael is asked there. So that's our figure that we calculated, and you can see all the details in the report, which, as I said, is on the website. So we've calculated it's £500 million. The figure they put on it is 100 and something million pounds. That's what they spend anyway. I think the actual grant is somewhere in the 85 million region. And as far as I'm aware, they get it all in one lump sum each year. But the £500 million is made up of a whole load of other costs. So if you take the £100 million that they admit to spending, you add the security, which is probably somewhere in the region of £150 million. You add the cost to local councils when they go around the country cutting ribbons. Your local council, your local police will probably end up with a big bill. And you add unpaid taxes, and of course you add the revenue and the assets of the two duchies, then you get to somewhere in the region of 510 million pounds, £500 million. I mean, even the Times leader wrote up this report that we put out saying, this is pretty accurate, and it shouldn't be up to the public to try and work it out. It should be in black and white, published and made available to everybody. So that's where the £500 million comes from. It comes from a whole load of different sources. Lucy's asking about the legal case for leaseholders in Cornwall. I mean, I should say it's not the whole of Cornwall, so it's just land that's owned by the Duchy, which is like directly by the Duchy, so they're the freeholders. I don't know. I mean, Alan Davis has been looking into this for years, and it's quite a struggle because they have legal exemptions. But I think that it's not something we're going to necessarily give up on. I think as we get bigger and we get some more resources and we're going to get a bit more time to look into it, I think legal action is something that the public would want to try and support. And if there are people that are prepared to do that, then we can look at that. But yeah, I mean, the situation, as you said, is definitely worse for someone on Duchy of Cornwall land than someone who is a private leaseholder, because you simply don't have the same rights. And that, is absolutely disgraceful. But unfortunately, the law, as far as I'm aware at the moment, doesn't really give you a lot of wiggle room without, I guess, going all the way up to the Supreme Court, which can be very expensive. Yep. Just scrolling down here. Good to have a more relevant national anthem. Absolutely agree. We'll probably get on to the anthem at some point. We've certainly done a video a little while ago. Did a radio program a while back saying that, and someone phoned in suggesting we should change the national anthem to the anthem of SpongeBob SquarePants, which I suggested couldn't be worse than what we have, but I don't know whether that will happen. But Ruth, if the monarchy paid their fair share of tax, that would boost the Treasury's coffers in one fell swoop. Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of tax. I mean, it's millions, it's tens of millions, but it's not, we have a multi-trillion-pound economy. But these are big numbers that I think the cost of the monarchy can pay for. That £500 million figure can pay for thousands of nurses or police officers or teachers. And the Irish president, for example, only cost about £4 million. So yeah, the tax, absolutely. But the whole cost is an absolute disgrace. And of course, last week the government suggested that the coronation cost £72 million. It definitely cost more than that because they only admitted to a small part of the cost. Now that £72 million would pay for 27 million free school meals in a country where a lot of kids are going without school meals because their parents don't have the money. So this is not small change. Alan asked about the BBC and bias and so on. We'll definitely get back on that as well at some point. I think it's really important. We are pushing the BBC fairly regularly, and we will keep on pushing that. We've got some new projects coming up to do that. They are, quite frankly, shameful in the way they cover the royals. I mean, some of the other broadcasters aren't much better, but the BBC really are the world leaders in deferential coverage. Yeah, I mean, I think there's some comments here and questions about how to get this out there. I mean, this is one of the things we're going to say about the campaign. We're getting a lot more out there, and obviously it's not all on Republic. A lot of this stuff, people like Led by Donkeys, which did a really cool stunt a couple of weeks ago about this dispatches and dispatches itself. And one of the things that I'm noticing is that people are more willing to pick up these issues. It's not just on us anymore. And we have, I think, made an impact on that. We have influenced people's thinking on this so that and it is easier now to to step up and speak up on these things. And people are willing to criticize the monarch. When the Queen was on the throne, that wasn't the case. The criticism would all be deflected down the line. And we have right from the start made it clear that Charles wasn't going to inherit that deference. So, yeah, Alistair asking about the funding of the Prince Andrew hush money. Well, I mean, this is an interesting point because we allow the duchies to pay their profits as private income to the monarch and heir. The understanding, and it's never been confirmed, is that £12 million was paid to Virginia Giuffre to avoid Andrew going to court, a woman that he said he never met, but he still paid £12 million. He doesn't have £12 million. It's understood that that money came from the Queen and Charles from their duchy incomes. So again, that was money that should be going into local communities, instead going into keeping Prince Andrew out of court, when he should very much be in court. Yeah, Karen, I think your question got cut off there about inheritance tax. This is a really important and interesting point. The inheritance tax has become obviously quite a big issue lately. And Charles didn't pay any at all. Not only did he not pay it, but it's understood that he would have received the entire inheritance from his mother, therefore avoiding tax, and then would have gifted it out to the family so that none of them paid inheritance tax. And this is understood to be what the Queen did when her mother died in 2002. So she would have avoided the inheritance tax, and then gifted out the rest of it to the rest of the family untaxed. But yeah, this has become an issue, and we will return to this. But it was very interesting that I think this might have been BBC actually, that a journalist did directly put this to a government minister, saying, "Why is Charles not paying inheritance tax?" in relation to this big row that happened the other week. And the government minister just sort of weaseled out of it, really saying, "Well, I'm not going to comment on individual cases." But of course, this isn't an individual case. It's a case of a public servant. It's a case of the head of state who is not compelled to pay it. And we should therefore be asking these questions specifically about him. Now there's a question there about William's homelessness project, which is interesting. One also interesting thing, ITV did this documentary about William's homelessness, and they played a clip of James O'Brien on LBC reading out one of my comments criticizing William for his homelessness project, being a hypocrite and so on. Now, that again is, this is a puff piece documentary made by ITV for William. So it's interesting that they felt the need to do that. I have then written to William saying, well, if you say that criticism drives you forward, then why don't we meet so I can give you a whole load more? I haven't heard back as yet. So we're coming to the end. A few more questions coming in. There's an interesting question about the influence that the royals have in policy. Now, there's been quite a lot sort of talked about this over the years. Certainly, Charles has lobbied quite a lot. There's, I think it's definitely happening more than people realize, and I think that the big question is they have leverage. They have complete secrecy as to who they speak to and who they meet. They have the opportunity to demand that things are done for them and possibly for their friends, and they are friends with some fairly questionable people. So I think that there are some serious questions to be had about the influence that the royals have on government. The other thing, I guess, to say, just as in response to two or three of these questions that have come up about kind of raising the things like charity and so on, because it's being suggested that, you know, somehow this is, you know, we've talked about the costs and the outrages, and some people say, well, you know, they do so much good and all the rest of it. There's no evidence of this, and this is the thing. We pay William £23 million. He does hardly anything. You know, he can fit all of his engagements. If you fitted it into a full-time schedule, you'd get it done in a month. You know, it's really not that much. And what he does isn't work. It's attendance. He turns up, looks stilted and awkward, and goes home again. And it's been shown by an organization called Giving Evidence that specializes in doing sort of data analysis for the charity sector, that having a royal patron makes very little difference, in fact, no difference, according to them, in income and success. So, yeah, I mean, there's really nothing that we get back in exchange for all this. But even if there was, that's not an excuse for corruption, for not paying taxes, for abusing public money. You know, you can be an absolute angel, but if you don't pay your taxes and you spend public money on yourself, that's not okay. Two very quick final questions, and then we're going to wrap up. But I really want to say thank you very much. We had a huge turnout. It's been fantastic. Loads of really interesting questions. So someone's asked if I've met Charles. I've excuse me, I've been within close shouting proximity of him. At some point, I'm going to ask for a meeting. I might even challenge him and William to a debate on TV. They're not going to obviously respond, but I think that it would be quite interesting to see how others might respond to that sort of thing, because it makes the point that they don't want to really face their critics. They don't like being challenged. They don't like being questioned, and they're not used to it, and they wouldn't cope with it. One final thing about whether we're working closely with supporters elsewhere in the Commonwealth, the answer is yes. We've got a lot of good contacts around the Commonwealth in Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and also across the Caribbean. I am actually currently talking to some people about potentially creating an alliance of Commonwealth Republican movements, similar to the alliance of European Republican movements that we have happening at the moment, which has been going strong since 2010. So, look, I just want to say thank you again. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope the format works. This has been recorded, so it will be on YouTube as well. I just want to say again, subscribe to Republic's emails and to our YouTube channel. Get involved. Check out the website where you can find out more. Check out the shop. There's a whole bunch of books. Obviously, there's mine, shamelessly promoted there. But Norman Baker's book is brilliant as well. There's a whole load of others that are available there. And get involved with Republic Day and Trooping the Colour. These are two big dates that we want lots of people to come along to. Beyond the Royal Headlines, brand new thing. First Tuesday of every month. The next one is King and the Constitution, 7 p.m, January 7th. Look forward to seeing you there. And thank you very, very much for coming along.